Let's paint the scene. You're in a multi-lap fight, trying to catch up to the guy in front. Whatever you do, he just seems to be a tad more consistent, and it requires all of your track knowledge to keep up with him. Every lap you keep pushing your own limits, hoping this will give you an edge to catch up to your rival. But then suddenly, you've overdone it.
Making mistakes can happen to the best of us, and it's in those moments that we learn the most and that we grow as racers to go on to reach a next level. But I also do know that making mistakes can be oh so frustrating if you have no idea how to handle your car when you do reach that point of no return. So in today's video, I'm going to try and teach you some techniques to do some damage control or even avoid getting into a crash altogether. In today's video, everything you need to know about advanced car control. There are well over 1 million things that can go wrong at a racetrack, but the source of most of the trouble lay in between the steering wheel and the seat of the car. Now I know nobody wants to get into a crash, but when we try to find the limits, it just seems inevitable. The three inputs that are generating trouble are accelerating, steering, and braking. So of course this video is segmented into these three parts, plus we're gonna have a little introduction into the traction circle, as this will help us understand why things go wrong and how to fix them in the future. Some very smart people have decided to model and simplify the connection between a driver's inputs and the available tire grip. It's called the grip circle, and although it's not entirely reflective of how it happens in real life, it gets us enough of an idea to clearly understand how we can improve ourselves. The vertical line shows us how much our car is accelerating or braking. Meanwhile, the horizontal line will show us the driver's turning inputs. The circle itself shows us the maximum available grip. Go outside of that line and you will run out of grip and spin. Stay inside of it and you guessed it, you're not using the maximum available grip, but that's not always needed either, of course. It's a pretty simple model, but it shows us crucial information that we can use to improve ourselves. Let's say, for example, you are starting to brake in the braking zone. Then you might be somewhere over here on the graph. If you're trail braking at the end of the corner, you might be over here. Meanwhile, accelerating out of a twisty bit will put you here. As you can see, you can either use all of the available grip for one action, or you can combine them together to try and find the right middle ground. Now that we know this, it's time to go and fix your mistakes. Now, the purpose of this video is not to explain to you how to properly brake. We've already done that in a previous episode. No. This video is all about when things go completely south. So we're not gonna talk about what happens when you brake too early into a corner. We're gonna talk about what happens when you are about to completely miss your apex. So let's paint a scene. You're coming into a braking zone and you know you've already braked too late. Maybe it's 10 meters, 20 meters, or even 50 meters, but you're not gonna make the apex either way. So instead of trying to steer your car in, trying to find magically appearing grip out of nowhere, we're going to steer our car in a straight line and use all of that available grip from the traction circle, you know, to brake the car down. This might just help you to stay on track, but sometimes that's not even enough. So while you're doing so, try and look for possible runoff areas. Preferably tarmac, as that will slow you down more and might give you enough grip to steer the car back to the track. But if that's not available, I guess grass is just as good of an option. You just gotta be a bit careful when you go back from grass to tarmac, as sometimes the car can get a little bit skittish when the grip levels are different. So try and keep a shallow line when going back on track. Now, when you've managed to brake down the car enough, get off that brake pedal as soon as possible and use the rest of the available grip to turn your car back on track. So once again, looking at the grip circle, you will understand why. Now, on some tracks you have runoff and on others you don't. And when you don't have runoff, I guess the only way you can kind of salvage the situation is by trying to get as shallow of an angle of contact with the barrier. This will help you mitigate some of the kinetic forces and should give you a little bit of a lighter damage penalty. This is as close to braking understeer as we're going to get. But what happens when you get brake-induced oversteer?
Like we saw in a previous episode, if you turn and brake at the same time, the rear of your car is gonna step out, especially if your brake bias isn't set up right. This problem is especially frequent in rear-engined cars and older race car models. Brake-induced oversteer is almost instantaneous. What I personally would do is keep the brake pressure constant to avoid any further balance shifts and try and regain control of the car while doing so. Once you set the car back into a normal trajectory, think about releasing the brakes gradually to stop the tires from locking and regain traction.
Perfecting your braking technique and keeping it consistent can be quite tricky, but with practice you should be able to avoid most mishaps. Apart from gathering more experience, there's not much more you can do to get better at this, so keep on practicing. Whether your throttle pedal causes you over or understeer is highly dependent on the car you drive. Front-wheel drive cars, for example, will tend to understeer into the corners. Meanwhile, rear-wheel drive cars will oversteer when you overdo it. The easiest one to fix, by far, is throttle understeer. If you experience throttle understeer, that means you've been asking too much from your front tires. Simply lift off your foot from the throttle pedal and allocate more grip towards turning. It's as easy as that. Once you lift off that throttle pedal, you should be good to go and make that corner easily. Now on to the more technical aspect of throttle control. Now we all know we should start counter steering when we lose the back end to our car, but when the car catches a lot of angle, a lot of us are out of their depth. Essentially, in that moment when the car oversteers so much, what you want to do is catch a drift. And yes, drifting will actually make you better at doing this, up to a point of course. So if you want to better your instinct at catching cars that oversteer, what you want to do is practice drifting. Now hold on, before you become the next drift king, let's go over the steps to catching an oversteering car or, well, catching a drift, as those are both essentially the same thing.
In the first part of the movement, the car will lose traction. In drifting, this is intentional and happens at the start of the corner. Meanwhile, when you oversteer in a race, it's mostly unintentional and happens at the end of a corner. At this point, you want to keep a constant throttle input. It's extremely important that you keep your foot at a constant pressure for this to work. If you don't, your rear tires will regain grip suddenly, setting you spinning into the other direction, creating snap oversteer. Now watch out not to increase your throttle either, as this will just increase your spinning angle, making it almost impossible to catch the car and sending you into a 360 spin. Almost at the same time as you feel the car spinning, you'll start counter steering, or if your wheel has strong force feedback, you will actually let go of the wheel completely. Just like in real life, this will actually make your front wheels face in a straight line relative to your speed and thus help us go into the right direction. Once you have the car drifting in a controlled manner, you want to bring the steering wheel back into a straight line. This will require you to gradually decrease the throttle input to regain traction, as this will determine the angle of the car, and at the same time you will be unwinding your wheel. And I mean physically unwinding it. You want to steer the car back in place as you are the one in control at that point. Once you're facing in the right direction again, that's it really.
If you need more of a hands-on approach on how to practice drifting, I made a tutorial on how to start learning drifting. I personally believe that I've actually caught a lot of cars thanks to the fact that I've learned drifting. So give it a go and let me know what you think. The only situation I can personally think of where a professional driver might lose his car because of excessive turning inputs is when avoiding another car on track. Now, drivers will always try to be as smooth as possible, but sometimes there's just no other result but to aggressively turn to avoid the opposition. In those situations, there's not much you can do, as you will mostly be a passenger, but we can try and do some damage control.
Let's say you aggressively turn the wheel to avoid an incident and are now having to take back control of a wayward car. All the weight of your car will have shifted towards one side of the car, putting most of the load on your rear outside tire. To recover from this situation, what you should do is put in some brake pressure. Doing so will shift the weight back to the front, allowing you to recover some steering input and controlling the car somewhat.
Depending on the traffic around you, it might be very difficult to get out of a situation unscathed, even for the best drivers out of us. So sometimes you just gotta accept that you couldn't do anything about the crash and be happy that you kept as much control as you did. In other situations, it's better to not do anything at all than even try to catch your car. That technique we talked about earlier about catching a drift, for example, should never be attempted in heavy traffic conditions, because the only thing that will happen is that you will make yourself much less predictable to other drivers, and you might even impair their vision by creating extra smoke on track. So I guess my last tip is that sometimes you just gotta accept that you couldn't do anything about the crash and hope it doesn't happen again. Whatever you do though, always hold your brakes, because whatever happens in any case, making yourself a little slower will always help your fellow competitors to avoid a crash. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Make sure to get in loads of practice before the next guide. I'm trying to make these as quickly as I can, but my schedule is very tightly packed. Next episode is going to be all about defensive maneuvers. So in many ways, part 2 to our episodes on overtakes. Make sure to subscribe not to miss that episode, and I'll see you space racers in the next one. Goodbye.